The package arrived on a Wednesday, wedged behind the storm door where the delivery driver leaves things when nobody answers. I brought it in with the mail and the recycling bin and set it on the counter for 2 hours before I opened it, because I assumed it was the replacement gasket for the dishwasher. It was a photo book, cream linen cover, the kind of thing you order online at 11 at night when you can't stop looking at pictures of a baby. The first page was my husband, Grant, sitting in a hospital chair in a shirt I had washed maybe 400 times, with a newborn in the crook of each arm and an expression on his face I had not seen in 9 years of marriage. Not happiness. Something bigger and stupider than happiness. The look of a man who thinks he has finally been let in on a secret the universe was keeping from him. Under the photo, in that curly script the websites all default to, somebody had typed, Day 1. Daddy meets his girls. I turned the page. There was my sister in a hospital bed, hair damp at the temples, holding both of them against her chest. The shipping label had my address on it, not because anyone wanted me to see it, because the account it was ordered from was an account Grant opened in 2019 to print our Christmas cards, and the default shipping address was still this house. 9 years of marriage, and the thing that finally told me the truth was a saved autofill field. I didn't scream. I want to be honest about that, because people expect a scream and there wasn't one. I stood in my kitchen with the storm door still open behind me, cold air moving across my ankles, and I turned every page of that book all the way to the end. 24 pages, 2 babies, my sister's hands, my husband's wedding ring, still on in almost every photo. Then I closed it, put it back in its envelope, and went to the sink to wash a coffee cup that was already clean. My name is Simone Hartley. I'm 41. I'm a structural engineer, which mostly means I get called when a building starts doing something the drawings never said it would do. Cracks in the wrong direction, a floor that flexes half an inch more than the math allows, doors that stop closing on the 3rd floor for a reason that lives in the basement. Here's the first thing you learn in my line of work. A building almost never fails where the crack is. The crack is just where the failure surfaced. If you patch the plaster looks beautiful, and the building keeps dying, quietly, on a schedule you can't see. You have to find the load path. You have to go down into the dark and find the beam that stopped carrying what it promised to carry. 9 years. I had been staring at plaster for 9 years. I met Grant when I was 31, at a fundraiser I hadn't wanted to attend, held in a converted warehouse whose roof trusses I spent the first 20 minutes admiring instead of talking to anyone. He came over and asked what I was looking at. Most men would have pretended to care for 90 seconds. He made me explain it twice, and then he tipped his head back and looked up at the ceiling for a long time and said, "So it's been holding this whole time and nobody's ever thanked it." I married him 14 months later. Grant sold commercial real estate. He was good at it in the way certain men are good at things, by walking into a room already convinced the room was glad to see him. He was warm. He remembered the names of everyone's kids. When my father died, Grant sat with my mother for 6 hours and got her to laugh twice. And I loved him for that, in a way I don't think I ever fully unwound afterward, even when I probably should have. We wanted children the way you want the next season. Not urgently, just certainly. It didn't come. Not that year, not the next. Then came the referrals, the calendars, the vocabulary, follicle counts, trigger shots, the little sharps container on the back of the toilet that I hid in a cabinet whenever anyone came over. I had a bruise on the left side of my abdomen for so long that it stopped being a bruise and started just being a place. 4 rounds, 2 losses, both early, both at the point where the thing is still a flicker and a number and a maybe. The second one I found out about in the parking garage under my office building, sitting in my car with the engine off. And I remember thinking with total clarity that I could not go back upstairs, and then going back upstairs and running a beam calculation and getting it right. Grant was there for all of it. That's the part nobody wants to hear. He drove me. He sat in the chairs. He learned the names of the medications. On the bad nights, he'd put his forehead against mine and say the same sentence, always the same one. "We're not out of it, Sim," and I believed him, the way you believe a floor. The 5th round was the last one. My body had gotten worse at it, not better. We ended up with 2 embryos, and Dr. Vale sat across from us with her hands flat on the desk and told us that at my age, with my numbers, this was likely where the road ended. We could transfer them or we could store them and decide later. Grant asked what she'd do. She said she never answers that question. We stored them. 11 months later, Grant came home and told me the clinic had called him. The thaw had failed, both of them. He said the word non-viable like it was a stone he had carried in his mouth the whole drive. I want you to understand what that day did to me, because it is the load-bearing wall of everything that came after. I did not fall apart. I nodded. I asked practical questions about the paperwork. And then, over the next 4 years, I quietly assembled the belief that I was the reason. My eggs, my lining, my 40-year-old body, which had been strong enough to climb scaffolding in February, and not strong enough to do the only thing I actually wanted it to do. I apologized to my husband. In the dark, more than once. I told him I was sorry he'd married me. He never once said, "Don't be." He said, hey, come here. Which is a different thing entirely. And it took me until I was standing in that kitchen with a linen photo book to understand exactly how different. My sister's name is Talia. She's 5 years younger than me, and she has, since she was about 11, occupied a specific position in our family, the one who feels things properly. I was the one who was fine. Talia was the one who cried at the funeral, who needed rides, who called at midnight, who was struggling. When our father died, 3 separate relatives asked me how Talia was holding up. Not one asked me. I never resented it. I want to be clear about that, because I've had a year to turn this over, and I don't think I'm rewriting history. I liked being the one who was fine. It gave me somewhere to stand. Talia came to my transfers. She brought me a hot water bottle shaped like a fox after the second loss, and she sat on the end of my bed and cried harder than I did. She'd say, "I don't know how you do this." She'd say, "You're so much stronger than me." Admiration and hunger sound identical from the outside. Nobody tells you that. They use the same words, the same face, the same hand on your arm. The only difference is what happens when you set something down. Talia called 40 minutes after the package arrived. I looked at her name on the screen for a long time, and then I answered, and I didn't say anything. "Simone," she said. And then, when I still didn't speak, the book was supposed to go to Mom's. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "I can explain," a logistics correction. She had already known the risk existed and had already decided how she'd handle it if the address ever betrayed her, and what she reached for, in the actual moment, was the shipping label. "Okay," I said, and I hung up. I'd like to tell you that I then did something enormous. I made a grilled cheese sandwich. I ate half of it standing over the sink. Then I went into the office, opened my laptop, and started a new folder, and I named it the way I name every folder at work. Hartley, Site Assessment. Because here's the second thing you learn in my line of work, and it's the one that saved me. When a building is failing, the worst thing you can do is start swinging a hammer at the crack. You don't demolish before you survey. You take the pictures. You pull the original drawings. You find out what was actually built versus what the plans said would be built. And you find out who signed off and when, and whether the signature is real. You don't confront, you document. Grant was in Columbus that week. He'd told me it was a portfolio walkthrough, and I'd said drive safe. And now I sat in a house that was very quiet and understood that I had said drive safe to a man who was going to hold his newborn daughters that night. The first thing I looked at wasn't the affair. That's what everyone assumes. Everyone assumes I spent that night on hotel receipts. I didn't care about hotel receipts. An affair is plaster. An affair is where the crack surfaced. What I could not stop thinking about, standing at that sink, was one detail in one photograph on page 11 of that book. Talia in the hospital bed, newborn twins on her chest. And in 9 years of doctors and charts and Dr. Vale's flat hands on the desk, I had learned exactly how rare it is for a woman to conceive twins the way Talia would have had to conceive them. Not impossible. Rare. And my sister has PCOS. She has had it since she was 19. She used to say it was the one thing she and I had in common, which was a joke, and which was also the reason she'd told me, at my own kitchen table 4 years ago, holding a glass of wine, that she'd never wanted kids anyway. "Saves me the trouble," she said. "You're doing enough for both of us." So the question I sat down with that night was not who is my husband sleeping with. The question was, where did those babies come from? I started with the bank, because money keeps better records than people do. Grant and I ran separate accounts and one joint one, an arrangement everyone had always told me was unromantic, and which turned out to be the single most useful decision of my adult life. The joint account paid the mortgage, the utilities, and about a dozen small recurring charges that neither of us had looked at in years. One of them was for $240 every 12 months in March. Northgate Repro, annual. Northgate is the clinic. That charge is the storage fee. It's what you pay to keep embryos frozen in a tank in a room in a building on Ellsworth Avenue. I scrolled back. March 4 years ago. March 3 years ago. 2 years ago. Last year. The thaw failed 4.5 years ago. Grant told me both embryos were gone 4.5 years ago. We had been paying to store something for 4.5 years after it stopped existing. I sat back in my chair in a dark office in a house I'd lived in for 9 years, and I felt the room change temperature. Not because I understood yet, because I understood that there was something to understand, and that it was underneath everything, and that it had been under there the entire time, quietly not carrying what it had promised to carry. I opened a spreadsheet. I titled the first column Date and the second column Source and the third column Discrepancy, and then I stopped because my hands were doing something odd, and I looked down and realized they were completely steady. That was the part that frightened me. I did not sleep that night, and I don't say that for effect. I say it because at 4 a.m. I found the second thing. Grant kept his tax documents in a fireproof box in the hall closet, which he thought of as security and which I thought of as a filing system with a handle. Under the 2022 returns, in a manila envelope with nothing written on the outside, was a lease. A 2-bedroom on Beechwood, signed a little over 3 years ago, in his name, with a second occupant listed, Talia Marsh. 3 years. Not a hotel, not a mistake. A lease renewed twice, with a utility account and a renter's insurance policy, and a parking space numbered 41. I want to describe what that felt like, and the honest answer is that it felt like almost nothing. It felt like reading a report about somebody else's building. The grief came later, in pieces, at inconvenient times, in the car, in the grocery store, standing in front of the yogurt for 6 full minutes. But in that closet at 4 a.m, I just took a photograph of the lease with my phone, put it back exactly where it had been, and thought, that's the lease. Where's the consent form? Because a clinic cannot thaw an embryo and transfer it into a woman on the strength of one signature. It takes 2, both people who made it. There are forms, there are witnesses. There is, somewhere, a piece of paper with my name on it. I went into work the next morning and did an 8-hour day, and I was good at it, and nobody noticed anything. Then I drove downtown and sat in a lawyer's waiting room. Her name was Cass Whitfield, and she had a corner office with terrible carpet, and she listened to me for 11 minutes without writing anything down. When I finished, she asked one question. Do you want to hurt him, or do you want to know? I want to know, I said. Then I'll decide. She said that was the first sane answer she'd heard that month. Then she told me that a patient has an absolute right to their own medical file, that the clinic could not refuse me, and that if I was correct about what I would find in it, I should not go alone. 2 days later, I filed for divorce. Grant did not know. He was in Columbus, or he was on Beechwood, and he texted me a photo of a sandwich, and I sent back a thumbs up because the paperwork was already sitting in a drawer downtown, and there was nothing left in me that needed to argue. The clinic gave me an appointment for the following Tuesday. Northgate hadn't changed. Same gray carpet, same watercolors of sailboats, same fish tank in the corner that I once stared at for 45 minutes while a nurse tried to find a vein. Dr. Renata Vale came out to the waiting room herself instead of sending anyone, and that told me something before she said a word. She was older. So was I. She took me to her office and set a file on the desk between us, and she kept her hand on it. Before you open this, she said, I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish. When you called, I pulled your chart. I've spent 5 days with it, and with our compliance officer, and with our attorney. She stopped. I have practiced for 26 years. I have never had to say this to a patient. I said nothing. Silence gets people to the point faster than any question I've ever asked. Your embryos were not non-viable, she said. They were transferred, both of them, on the 9th of March, 3 years ago, into a recipient, under a consent form bearing your signature, witnessed and countersigned. The fish tank made a noise. I remember that. I never signed anything, I said. I know. She turned the file around and opened it and slid it toward me and did not take her hand off the desk, as though the paper might move on its own. I know because I've now looked at it beside 4 other documents you've signed for us over 9 years. There it was, my name, Simone R. Hartley. Except the R had a loop that closed, and mine has never closed, because I'm left-handed and I drag the pen instead of pushing it, and the S leaned forward and mine leans back, and I have been signing my name on structural drawings for 18 years, and a signature is a thing I know the way other people know a voice. Somebody had practiced. That's what got me. The forgery wasn't sloppy. Somebody had sat down with a document I'd signed and practiced my name until it was close enough to fool a receptionist on a Tuesday morning. Who witnessed it? I asked. Dr. Vale said a name. Donna Ruiz, a scheduling coordinator who had left the clinic 18 months later and whose signature sat in the witness box under mine. And my husband's consent? She turned another page. Also on file, dated the same morning, signed in the office. Is his real? Dr. Vale looked at it for longer than she needed to. Yes, she said. His is real. Behind it was the recipient intake, filled out in blue ink by hand. Under relationship to intended parents, in my sister's handwriting, in letters I would know at 100 yards, one word, sister. I looked at that word for a long time. In a medical file, in a clinic on Ellsworth Avenue, in blue ink, in my sister's handwriting. I've done a lot of failure analysis. I've stood in buildings that killed people. I have never in my life felt what I felt in that chair, which was the whole 9 years turning over at once, like a photograph developing in reverse. Every apology I'd made in the dark. Every time I'd lain awake and run the arithmetic on my own body and come out guilty. The hot water bottle shaped like a fox. Those 2 babies in that linen photo book were my daughters. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, genetically, chromosomally, in the only sense a lab cares about. My sister had carried my children, and my husband had signed my name to let her, and then he had come home and told me about a thaw that failed and gone to bed beside me for 4.5 years. Dr. Vale said something about an internal review, about her deep regret, about how a coordinator's failure to verify identity was a failure of the clinic and therefore hers. I heard maybe a third of it. She made me copies of everything, and she made them herself, standing at a machine in the corner of her own office, and she handed them to me warm. At the door she said, "Mrs. Hartley, do you have someone to sit with tonight?" I said yes. It was the only lie I told anybody that entire year. Cass Whitfield read the file the next morning, and when she was done, she took off her glasses and put both hands flat on the desk in a way that reminded me so much of Dr. Vale that I nearly laughed. "Simone," she said, "I want to be precise about this. Forging a spousal consent to a reproductive procedure isn't a betrayal. It's a crime. And separately from that, in this state, you are almost certainly the legal mother of 2 children who are currently being raised by your sister. I know. Do you want them?" "I don't know what that sentence means yet," I said. "Ask me in a month." She nodded and wrote nothing down again, and I understood that this was a thing she did on purpose. So I built the file. That's what I do. Every storage invoice, every lease, every date, every discrepancy, laid out in a column with no adjectives anywhere near it. I didn't editorialize. Facts don't need me angry on their behalf. They hold their own load. And here's what I kept coming back to, at 2 a.m, with a spreadsheet open and a cold cup of tea beside it. Grant is not careful. Grant is charming, which is a different skill and often the opposite one. Grant could not have practiced my signature. Grant could not have kept a storage fee running on a joint account for 4 years without ever once thinking about the fact that I reconcile that account every March. Somebody had done the careful parts. Somebody who knew my handwriting because she'd had 18 years of birthday cards to study. Somebody who knew I'd blame my own body because she'd sat on the end of my bed while I did it. Grant's mother called me 8 days after I filed. Eleanor and I had always been fine. Better than fine, actually, in a way that had confused both of us slightly. She sent me clippings about bridges. She had once driven 90 minutes to bring me soup during a stomach flu and then refused to come inside because she didn't want to catch it, and stood on my porch talking to me through the glass for an hour. She didn't say hello. "Simone," she said, "are you alone?" "Yes." I heard her breathe. She's a woman who irons napkins. She has never in her life said an unfinished sentence to me. "Don't make me be the one to tell him," she said. I put my hand flat on the counter. "Tell who what, Eleanor?" She started crying, not delicately. The sound of a 72-year-old woman coming apart in her own kitchen is a sound I would like to never hear again. And through it, she kept saying a version of the same thing, over and over, like it was the only structure holding her up. "He doesn't know. He doesn't know, Simone. He still doesn't know." We met at a coffee place halfway between our houses, one we'd been to a dozen times, and she was already sitting down when I came in, with her hands around a cup she hadn't touched. She looked at me and started talking before I sat. 3 years ago in March, I drove Talia to a clinic on Ellsworth Avenue, she said. She told me it was a consultation. She told me she was thinking about freezing her own eggs, and that she didn't want to tell you because of everything you'd been through, and I thought, that's kind. That's a kindness. She turned the cup a quarter turn. I was in the waiting room for 2 hours, and then a nurse came out and asked me if I was with the carrier and asked whether I'd be driving her because she'd need to lie flat. "Eleanor." I didn't know what the word meant. Her voice went up, then broke. "I want you to believe that. I asked her in the car. I said, 'Talia, what did that woman mean?' And she pulled onto the parkway and told me, calm as anything, that you and Grant had 2 embryos left, and that you couldn't carry, and that she was doing something for her sister that most people wouldn't do. She said you didn't want to talk about it. She said, 'Don't ever bring it up to her, Eleanor, she'll cry.' She put her hand over her mouth. 'She let me believe you knew,' she said. 'For 3 years I have been carrying around this idea that you were this brave, private, quiet woman, and that I wasn't allowed to say the thing I most wanted to say to you. And Grant told me a completely different story.'" "What story?" Eleanor looked up at me, and I watched a woman arrive at the bottom of something. "He thinks it's a donor," she said. "He thinks they used an anonymous donor egg. That's what she told him. That's what he's told me twice, sitting at my table with his hand on her back." I sat there in a coffee shop with a bell on the door and understood that there were not 2 people in this story who had lied to me. There was one architect, and there were 3 of us standing inside what she built. Eleanor asked me what she should do. I told her the truth, which was that I had no idea, and that I had spent 9 years being the person who managed everyone's feelings, and I was retiring from the position effective immediately. Then I said one more thing, and I've thought about it a lot since. I'm not going to tell him, Eleanor, not because I'm protecting him, because he's had 4.5 years to ask one question and he never asked it. If he finds out from me, he gets to make it about us. Let it come from where it actually came from. She said, "You're very hard, Simone." "I know," I said. "I got the training." The dinner was on a Sunday. Grant had been calling it properly for weeks, apparently. He wanted his mother to meet the girls properly, in her own house, in the good light, with the silver out. Eleanor told me afterward that she'd spent Saturday cleaning a house that was already clean, and that she'd changed her blouse 3 times, and that when she heard the car, she stood in the front hall with her hand on the banister and honestly considered walking out the back door and into the yard and just standing there until it was over. I wasn't there. I want to be clear that everything I'm about to describe I know secondhand, from a woman who told it to me twice, months apart, and told it the same way both times. Grant came in first. He does that. He arrives ahead of himself. Talia followed with a car seat in each hand, and Eleanor said she looked exhausted and radiant at once, the way people look when they've finally gotten the thing they organized their whole life around getting, and she said hello to Eleanor with an apology already loaded in her face, the way she'd been apologizing to everyone for a year, sweetly, about nothing. They set the seats down on the rug. Grant knelt and unbuckled one and lifted her out and stood up with her against his shoulder, and turned to his mother with an expression Eleanor described as boyish, and said the sentence he'd been saving. "Mom, say hi to your granddaughters." And Eleanor looked down into the face of a 9-week-old baby and saw, she told me, my father's chin. She said it hit her all at once, everything she had been carrying and quietly misfiling for 3 years, and it hit her in her legs first. She reached back for the banister. Grant's smile started to come apart at the edges, the way a man's does when he can see he's not getting the reaction he rehearsed. "Mom?" She said the room was completely silent. She said the only sound was the radiator, and then she looked past her son at my sister, standing behind him with the second car seat still in her hand, and she said the thing she had been holding in her mouth for 3 years. "She didn't tell you?" Eleanor told me that Talia's face did something she will never be able to unsee. It didn't crumple, it went smooth, like a hand passing over a bedsheet. 3 years of calculation arriving at the end of its runway. Grant said, "Tell me what?" And his mother, standing in her own front hall in a blouse she'd changed 3 times, said, "Grant, those are Simone's." He laughed. That's the detail that undid me when she got to it. He actually laughed, one short sound, because the sentence didn't mean anything yet, and then he stopped laughing, and then he turned around and looked at Talia. Eleanor said he stood there holding a baby and waiting for his wife's sister to make it not true. Talia said, "It's not that simple," which is, in my experience, what people say when it is exactly that simple. Here is what came out over the following 90 minutes, in a house with 2 infants asleep in their carriers and the good silver on a table nobody ever sat down at. 3.5 years ago, when I was still lying awake apologizing to my own body, Talia went to Grant. Not the other way around. She told him she'd carry for us. She told him she'd already talked to me about it, and I'd said no, that I'd been humiliated by the idea, that I couldn't stand to watch someone else do what I couldn't do, and that I'd asked her never to mention it again. She told him that if he ever brought it up to me, it would break me. She built a wall down the middle of my marriage and put a door in it that only she could walk through. Then, later, she told him she couldn't stop thinking about it, that she wanted a child of her own, that she'd found a clinic, that they'd use a donor egg, that all of it would be handled, that he only had to be a father. Grant, who had spent 4 years being told by everyone that he was so patient, so supportive, so good with me, said yes to being wanted. That's all it was. He has never once in his life been able to say no to being wanted. He signed what she put in front of him, a stack of forms at a kitchen table on beechwood, 40 pages, sticky tabs where the signature lines were. He never read the header. He never asked whose egg. He said later, on my porch, in the worst sentence of his life, that he hadn't asked because he was afraid the answer would be a stranger's, and he didn't want to picture that. He didn't want to picture a stranger, so he never looked. Dana Ruiz, the coordinator who witnessed my signature, went to college with my sister. It took Cass's investigator 40 minutes to find the photograph. Grant came to my house at 10:30 that night. I watched his headlights swing across the ceiling, and I sat still for a while. And then I opened the door before he could knock, because I was not going to have this conversation with a door between us. He had been crying in the car. His collar was wrong. He was holding nothing at all, which surprised me. I had expected him to be holding the photo book. "Simone," he said. "I didn't know." "I know," I said. I hadn't planned to say that. It came out first, ahead of everything I'd rehearsed at 2 a.m. with a spreadsheet open, because it was true, and because standing on my own porch looking at him, I understood that he was not the beam that failed. He was just plaster. He was the room where the crack happened to surface. He came in. I let him, because I wanted it to happen here, on my floor, in my house, where I could decide when it ended. He talked for a long time. He told me about the forms and the sticky tabs and the stories she'd told him about me. He said more than once, "She said you asked her not to talk about it." He said it like it was a load-bearing fact. Like if he could just get me to see the shape of what he'd been told, the rest would hold. I let him finish. 9 years of marriage and 18 years of failure analysis teach you the same lesson. People will show you the whole structure if you just stop interrupting. Then I said, "Grant, do you know what I did the week after we lost the second one?" He shook his head. "I went back to work in the afternoon and I ran the numbers on a parking structure and I got them right. And that night I lay next to you and I told you I was sorry you married me. Do you remember what you said?" He didn't. Of course he didn't. You said, "Hey, come here." My voice didn't move at all. "You never said it wasn't my fault. 4.5 years, Grant. You could have said one sentence. It isn't you. And you couldn't, because by then you knew it wasn't. And saying it out loud would have meant explaining how you knew." He put his face in his hands. "You didn't do the forgery," I said. "You did something smaller, and I think worse. You let me hold a weight you knew wasn't mine, because putting it down would have cost you an evening." He asked what happened now. I told him the divorce was already filed and had been for 11 days. I told him about the clinic's internal review and the compliance officer and the second set of copies sitting in Cass Whitfield's office. I told him that the district attorney's office was going to be interested in Dana Ruiz, and in the person who'd practiced my signature until it was good enough, and that no, I was not going to make that go away for my sister, and that he should stop asking before he'd started. Then he asked the only question that ever mattered. What are you going to do about the girls? Their names are Iris and June. They were on the last page of the photo book, and I had read them and not let them in. And then one night in March, I sat on my kitchen floor with that book open on my knees and let them in and stayed on the floor until it got light. Here's what I want you to understand, because I've read what people say about women in my position, and most of it is written by people who have never been in it. I could have taken them. Cass told me plainly, in this state, on this evidence, with a forged consent and a genetic parentage test and a criminal referral running in parallel, I would have won. Not maybe. Won. For about 6 days, I wanted to. I want to be honest about that. I wanted my sister to stand in a courtroom and watch 2 children she had stolen the beginning of walk out of her life the way she had walked out of mine. I had the drawings. I had the load path. I could have brought the whole thing down on top of her and slept fine. And then I sat in my car outside the house on Beechwood, which I had never once driven past, and I watched her carry 2 car seats up a set of concrete steps by herself in the rain, and I understood something I don't think I could have understood at 25. Those girls didn't do any of it. And a woman who takes children as an argument has made them into an argument for the rest of their lives. So I did the harder thing, which was the slower thing. I did not pursue custody. I pursued the truth, on paper, permanently. Cass filed for a determination of parentage. Talia contested it for 4 months, and then her lawyer looked at the forged consent and stopped returning her calls. And in November, a judge signed an order with my name on it, and my daughter's birth certificates were amended, and there is now no room left anywhere in the world for anyone to tell them a different story about where they came from. Talia is their mother in every way that a day and a bedtime make a mother. The court agreed. So do I, most days, and on the other days I go for a long walk. But she does not get to say she made them alone. She had 3 years of saying that. She has the rest of her life to not say it. She wanted to move to Arizona in the spring. She can't, not without leave of court, not while the parentage order stands. For the first time in her life, my sister is standing still. The clinic settled in 8 months and did not fight, which is what you do when you have already fired the coordinator and rewritten your identity verification protocol and you know exactly what a jury would do with a photograph of 2 signatures side by side. Dana Ruiz pled to a felony. My sister's case is still moving, slowly, the way those things move. I go when I'm asked to go. I answer what I'm asked. I have never once, in any deposition, called her a name. Grant sold his book of business and moved to Charlotte. He sends the girls a card on their birthday. He asked me once near the end of the mediation whether there was a version of this where we tried again, and I said no, and he said okay, and I watched something in his shoulders let go, because I think he'd been afraid I'd say yes. Eleanor and I still talk. She sends me clippings about bridges. She apologized to me exactly once, properly, at the end of a phone call, and then she never brought it up again, and I have come to understand that as its own kind of respect. I see the girls on Saturdays. Last month I took them to the overlook above the river where you can see 4 bridges at once. Iris is 2.5 now, and she asked me what the ropes were, meaning the cables, and I crouched down next to her in the cold and told her that they aren't ropes. They're the reason the whole thing stays up, and that most people cross a bridge their entire lives without once thinking about what's carrying them. She said, "Why?" Because that's the only word she has right now. And I stood there holding her hand, and I thought about 9 years of paying an annual storage fee for something I'd been told didn't exist, and about a woman who said, "I don't know how you do this," while she was doing it to me, and about all the nights I lay in the dark and did arithmetic on my own body and got the wrong answer because somebody had changed the inputs. I never failed at anything. That's the part I had to go find in the dark myself, because nobody who knew was ever going to hand it to me. The strongest thing you will ever do is not survive the lie. It's stop paying to store it. If you've stayed with me this far, I'd like to know what you think. Would you have gone to court for those girls, or would you have done what I did? I go back and forth on it myself, some Saturdays more than others. Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from tonight because I read every one of them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and stay close. There are others waiting.